Thank you for the introduction, and I welcome all the participants today who've joined us for this interesting panel on liquidity. There are a lot of factors which essentially contribute to the success of a startup entity, but the most essential factor, that runs besides other things is liquidity management. In fact, most startups fail because they run out of money at some point or the other, and others fail due to the cash flow, the management bit. And this is why business owners must focus on liquidity, on management as part of their companies. What is liquidity? And to put it in simple words, it represents a company's financial performance and its ability to convert its assets into cash. Liquidity could also mean the degree, to which a company can meet its cash obligations without experiencing major losses, whether it's short-term or long-term. Tying this up with how startups need to provide liquidity to their early stage investors and continue to grow, as part of their journey. What are your exit strategies? Though that may not be on top of, exit may not be on top of your mind when you start off the business. It needs to be structured well in your documents when you sign up to investment documents with your investors, and which is why, we believe that you're strategizing around the exit rights that you're providing to your investors becomes very important. So whether to go IPO or be acquired, getting onto the basics before we to understand what an IPO and what an acquisition and what are the different modes of acquisition. And IPO essentially refers to the process of offering your shares, shares of a private company to the public in a new stock issuance. Public share issuance allows a company, obviously, to raise capital from public investors. The transition from a private to a public company can be an important time for private investors, specifically, for them to fully realize the gains from the investments that they've made early on in the companies, as it typically includes, share premiums for existing private investors, and meanwhile also allowing public investors to participate in the offering. While on the other side, if we look at how an acquisition works, it is essentially the purchase by one entity or one person of controlling interest in the share capital, or all, or purchase of all of the assets or substantially all of the assets or liabilities of a target or of a startup entity. Now, acquisitions may be by way of acquisition of shares of the target, or it could be acquisition by way of assets and liabilities of the target, depending on how you are structuring it basis your commercial, the commercial objectives behind. And another way to do it could also be by way of merger and demerger under a court approval process, which is laid down in India, where you require national company law tribunals approval, and the process is run by the rule book. Now, founders who choose to go public over being acquired, often do so because it allows them to retain their independence and control, and they can continue to operate as a standalone company as opposed to becoming a division in a larger company. However, this independence and cultural freedom comes at a price. Now, public markets place much greater scrutiny on short-term performance than a strategic acquirer would really do. The public markets are not satisfied with what we call a one-hit wonder company who would only do one thing very well. They want companies to be diversified, offer multiple products, have a diversified and a multiple customer segment. So these are requirements which generally the public markets expect. They also expect consistent growth and profitability in a entity, in order to survive on the index. If bad news strikes, the public markets, obviously, we all know, become ruthless, and the listing regulations in India require significant transparency about companies' affairs and and the conduct and what is going on in the company in real time. On the other side, if we talk about acquisitions, and let me pick up an interesting example on that. The Instagram's acquisition by Facebook. While the company may have lost some independence in becoming part of a larger company, Insta clearly, as we saw, benefited tremendously from the acquisition. It not only got exposure to one of the largest user bases in the world, but Insta also, benefited from, the talent, the treasure, and the processes that Facebook, brought on board in terms of the acquisition. The market power of Facebook, again, allowed Instagram to launch and grow new products quickly, including the launch of Insta Stories, for instance. So, I think, from here on, I would like to, with the flavor of what is an IPO and what is an acquisition look like, I would direct my first question to Soumya. Soumya, if you could just, let the audience know what are the different kinds of exits that are available to an Indian investor, and how are they really structured in a document?
Thanks, Harshita. So, like just taking off from the point that Harshita was discussing, the way exit options are structured in especially Indian deals are basically there is an obligation on the promoters or the promoter group, as we say, to provide an exit to the investors. And when we use the term investors here, we are talking about purely financial investors, because as we understand, the entire concept of liquidity is something which may not mean the same for different classes of shareholders. For example, for a promoter, liquidity in a very literal context would mean taking the company public, depending on the scalability and the public fund requirement, etc., of the company. Whereas for an investor, it's something very simple to get a certain percentage of return on the investment and taking the money out. That's for a purely financial investor. Whereas for a strategic investor, the permutation and combination is completely different. Usually, we see that they eventually like to acquire a control stake in the company. So the whole concept of liquidity becomes very different in that sense. So just breaking up the concept of liquidity from an Indian deal perspective, there are two primary ways in which an investor can get liquidity. One is a way in which the investor is not dependent on the promoter or any other shareholder to take the money out. Or what we call is a third party sale. So basically, let's say that the fund has a life of about 7 to 8 years, and let's say the investor is holding the investment for about 5 to 6 years, and as per the valuation and the revenue and the profit numbers of the company, the investor is satisfied that he'll be able to find a good purchaser at a good price for these shares. He'll go ahead and sell his shares to either a strategic investor or to another PE fund or a VC fund. Here, there is not too much dependence on the promoters, because especially from a deal perspective, usually free transferability is given to the investors, except for very limited restrictions, the most common one being from restricting the investor from selling to a competitor. In some highly negotiated deals, we do see a right of first offer and a few other restrictions, but broadly, the investor is free to sell their shares. The second category of exit that we see is something which is driven by the promoter, which involves quote unquote the sale of the entire company. So one option for that is basically an M&A. Like Harshita pointed out, this could be done in multiple ways. One is either 75, which is usually considered as a controlling stake in the company, because especially from an Indian deal perspective and Companies Act perspective, you get the right to block all shareholder resolutions, basically, including ordinary special. So that is one aspect, one method in which it can be done, which involves the sale of the entire company. So it could be through a share sale, or it could be through an asset sale or a slump sale. And the second way in which you can do it is an IPO. And again, from a deal perspective, what usually happens is, from a decision making perspective, um, either the minimum capitalization of the IPO is predetermined and agreed in the documents, and as also from the perspective of a third party sale, or strategic sale of the company, sometimes the investors and the promoters at the this will be the minimum return that we are expecting on our investment. Alternatively, in very early stage investments, when it is not possible to make such predictions, in terms of decision making, there we call something an investor majority, whereby a group of investors come and decide what would be a good return of investment on these investments, and accordingly, one of these options may be availed of. A couple of other options for exit are, unlike being contractual, they are more statutory and related to the instrument. For example, a buyback of shares, which is undertaken by the company, or if it is a redeemable share, for example, a redeemable preference share, or a redeemable or an optionally convertible debenture, etc. What happens is, in that case, the company, out of the excess money that it undertakes this exercise of buyback or redemption. However, one key thing here to note is that, especially from a foreign investor perspective, because foreign investors can only be issued equity, compulsorily convertible preference shares, and debenture under the FDI route, this becomes a little bit of a challenge. Similarly, even for a buyback, there are certain statutory compliance on, out of what funds you can undertake the buyback, what kind of approvals are required, how much percentage of your share capital can be bought back. Also, there are certain tax implications because of which these two, though they are always provided in the documents, become a slightly sort of not very commonly used form of exit. And one of the last options that we see is again a form of strategic sale, but in this case, it is something that is triggered by the investor, what we call a drag sale. So usually what happens is, let's say about 7 or 8 years have passed since the investment, and the investors' fund life is coming to an end, and hence they need to liquidate their investments. And if they haven't been provided a sale or an exit option yet, they go to the market and try and find a buyer. And once they find a buyer, because typically a strategic buyer would be interested in buying a control stake in the company, the investors usually have the right to what we call drag the other shareholders of the company in such sale. So this is another form of acquisition, in which case it is triggered by the investor. So Harshita, these are the most commonly seen exit options in shareholder agreements in India.
Thanks, Soumya. Am I audible now? Because I think I got lost in terms of my audio when I was speaking about John and introducing him to the panel. Is it better now? Okay. So I think, yeah, Soumya, thank you so much for giving a quick overview of the different exit options which are available to, and as we see it in India. And over to you, John. And I think for the benefit of the audience, I will repeat myself and give a quick introduction to John because I was, my voice got lost. So John is the managing partner of the Singapore office at Dundas and Detmer, and he's been providing counsel on a number of private and public cross-border transactions, across the globe in terms of India, Singapore, Southeast Asia, China, Europe, and the States. And he's a marquee list of clients, and he represents global emerging growth technology companies and the venture funds which invest in those companies. So over to you, John, from here. And my question to you in continuation to where Soumya left is, what are the exit options and how do you see it differently when in cross-border transactions, particularly from a Singapore or a US perspective?
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Harshita, for the introduction and for having me. So I think a lot of the exit options are certainly similar in the cross-border context. I mean, I agree with the general bucketing of you have kind of pre-full exit of the company, secondary liquidity transactions that are structured typically, not always, but typically to get some liquidity for earlier, whether angel investors or seed or Series A investors. In some cases, those liquidity transactions are also used as an opportunity to allow the founders to take some money off the table as the company matures and moves forward. I think obviously the second, as we've talked about, would be a full acquisition of the company, whether that's in the context of a stock purchase, so purchasing 100% of or some controlling percentage of the outstanding stock. That's typically how I see deals structured for Singapore parent entities as well as for India companies. And then there's also obviously an asset sale. Similarly, you can sell substantially all of the assets. I think that's a little less common in my experience. And usually when we're looking at a full acquisition, it's going to be a stock purchase in this part of the world. I think the one unique aspect in a lot of ways, and why some folks find the United States markets and Delaware entities potentially more attractive. And I think there are a number of issues, both positive and negative, potentially with moving a company to a Delaware topco holding structure. But there is the availability of a pretty tried and true and tested merger statute in Delaware that is a bit unique, as I have seen, relative to, say, the Singapore Companies Act or the India Companies Act. That there's no real involvement in a court process. It's really a structural corporate means by which you merge two entities. And I think the advantage there is it does not typically require, subject of course to the underlying documentation and contractual agreement amongst the shareholders, it does not require the approval of 100% of the outstanding shares or all of the stockholders of a company. Under Delaware law, you can achieve a majority of the outstanding stock as being sufficient to trigger the merger statute. Of course, most acquirers are going to require a much higher threshold, usually in the order of 90+% of stockholders to approve, to prevent or provide some certainty in terms of appraisal rights that shareholders can seek under Delaware law. But it does provide a means by which you can effect a merger of two companies, again, without necessarily needing 100% of the shareholders to approve the sale of their shares directly to a third-party acquirer. And then the other path to liquidity is certainly an IPO. And I think certainly in the US markets, in the initial public offerings, especially for venture-backed companies, it is quite common not only to use the public offering due to the depth of liquidity and the depth of buyers on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. It's not only a means for a company to raise primary capital, but it is also quite commonly used as a means to list shares being sold as secondary shares. So existing stockholders can have their shares registered in the United States and offered for sale as part of the public float. And so an IPO is also and can also be used in the US markets as a means to get investors liquidity.
Thank you. Just to, after we've understood the different kind of structures that we see on exits and what are the different modes of exits which are available, I think it's important to get back and understand what are the rights and obligations and how are exits, in terms of documents and how we've seen, specifically from an India flavor perspective, how have we seen some of the typical clauses which are generally put in a document, and how do they tie up with the exit rights of the investors. So I think a couple of clauses there, and probably the most important is having an exit period. So when we sign up to documents with our investors, they usually, depending on the fund life or of the investors, and especially when they're venture backed, they insist on an exit period, which is that they want their investments to be materialized and returned off to them, and within a fixed time from the date that they're investing. So this exit period typically in India ranges from a time period to 3 to 5 years, within which the exit options which Samya listed out, whether it's a buyback or it's an IPO or it's a qualified public offering or it's a strategic sale, all of these need to be all of these become an obligation of the promoter and the company to facilitate to the investors within this period. Obviously there are a little bit of extensions and soft extensions provided by the investors to say that if there's a spillover, or let's say that after the expiry of the 3-year or the 5-year exit period, maybe they'll give a buffer of of a 3-month or a 6-month period to crystallize or to implement the actions which are listed in the agreement. But largely the obligation of the promoter to provide an exit to the investor needs to be completed and consummated within the exit period. So then the defining the exit period right in your term sheets, it becomes a very important element. Moving on to the other important provisions in an exit clause, and usually we've seen the investors insisting on a floor valuation to say that the exit is going to be favorable or acceptable to the investor. It should be at a minimum of X price. So that again becomes very important, because you're putting a number today to say that if the exit is not happening in X price, it may not be acceptable to the investor, and the investor may just deny the exit which is being facilitated by the promoters. So again, when you're negotiating your documents and when you're agreeing to this number, try and get close as to practicality as you can in terms of and in terms of numbers, because you're really sitting today and making a forecast for something which is going to be at the end of 5 years, and in a forecast in terms of your company's growth, because you will your number has to be as realistic as it could be to where your company will be in those, at that point in time at the exit period. So the floor valuation number, please be very careful while you're agreeing it with your investor. The third important definition, again, goes back to, going back to Soumya's discussion on who triggers these exit and who calls the exit. So while it remains the primary obligation of the promoter and the company to facilitate the exit, the investor calls it out and says, okay, this is what I want to do. And again, there are various methods in a transaction document, how we've seen. So either there is a waterfall to say that, within the expiry of XYZ, within the expiry of the exit period, this is the waterfall of exit, which will be followed, which is first goes IPO, then goes a third party, and then goes a buyback, and fourth goes a drag. Or it could.
So let me just take up the point that Harshita was discussing. So I will just briefly touch upon the trigger of exit point, because I already discussed that when I was speaking. So like I pointed out earlier, it's primarily the obligation of the promoters, failing which investors do get certain rights, like dragging along the remaining shareholders. Yeah.
Sorry, Soumya, can you hear me, or you guys lost me?
Yes. We can hear you now, but we lost you for the last 60 seconds or so.
Sure. So I was on the last clause, which is liqupref, essentially, where your liquidity proceeds, or the proceeds of your exit event, is going to be distributed in a particular manner as you've agreed with your investors. So while the Indian law clearly provides for preference shareholders to be given preference in terms of distribution of liquidity proceeds, there may be certain contractual arrangements or contractual preference that you would have agreed with your investor, which is what you will have to follow. Now, besides the distribution of liquidity proceeds, there is also an order of payment which has been contractually decided. So the investors insist that once an event happens or once an exit is happening, they go out first, then goes out, then for the smaller or the minority shareholders follow, and last the promoter goes. So these kind of orders are also usually, we've seen in documents being negotiated by the investors. So you have to be just very careful, and which is why we say that when you're drafting your exit clauses, or when you're agreeing to these exit clauses with your investors, be very careful in terms of the finer details that are inserted in those clauses, so that when you're implementing it, because it becomes a hard-coded obligation on you, when it comes to implementation, what are the objective criteria that you have to follow to facilitate the exit. From here on, and this question goes both to John and Soumya, in terms of what are the regulatory challenges that we've seen with an IPO or an M&A, from an India and a US perspective or a cross-border perspective. So maybe I'll direct it to Soumya first, and then then John.
Sure. Thanks, Harshita. So, primarily discussing the challenges with an IPO and M&A. So let me just lay out some of the conditions for an IPO in India, because that will really help us understand why really there are such few number of IPOs for venture capital backed companies. For example, some of the key conditions are a minimum net tangible asset of 3 crores, and there needs to be a track record of profitability and a net worth requirement. And also there are certain requirements on the promoters not being engaged in similar businesses, etc. So if you look at most of these conditions, it is very difficult for the kind of businesses in which venture capitals are investing to achieve this amount of scalability in a period of 3 to 5 years, like Harshita mentioned, which is what typically our exit clauses are like. And that is probably one of the main reasons why we don't see too many IPOs happening. Also, if you look at it from the perspective of the SEBI ICDR regulations, which basically is the governing code, sort of to say, for IPOs in India, there are also a lot of disclosure and compliance requirements during the run up to the listing, and also once your shares get listed. So, like Harshita pointed out, unless your business is such that you require that kind of public funds, which sort of necessitates your business to accept that level of disclosure and compliances. Those factors should really be considered before opting for the option of an IPO. Also, in terms of certain restrictions after the shares of a company have been listed, there are certain lock-in requirements both for promoters and non-promoter shareholding. Also, there is also an option for not just primary listing of shares of a company. There is also an option for what we call an offer for sale, which is basically offering for a secondary sale like you would do in an off-market transaction, the existing shares of a company to public shareholders. Um, Also, in terms of the entire process of listing of the shares of a company, it's a highly time-consuming and a very, very expensive affair. And it involves the convergence, a lot of parties involved. For example, you have your lead managers, and you're working with your promoters, you're working with your other shareholder, you're working with the stock exchanges, etc. So there are a lot of parties involved, and aligning the interests of all parties and achieving the listing sort of makes it difficult for an IPO for venture-backed companies to be a viable exit option. And in this regard, it will be interesting to just take a minute to talk about an option that SEBI came up with a couple of years back, and Harshita will be able to throw more light on it because she was also on the part of the committee that worked with SEBI on this. Something called an innovator growth platform. So that was a sort of listing option with a sort of relaxed condition and lock-in restrictions, etc. The framework was basically come out specifically from the perspective of making it easy for such companies to list. However, for a lot of reasons, even that platform hasn't really taken off in the way it has been expected to. Hence, the option that I'm going to be discussing now, which is a third-party sale, continues to be the most favored option for liquidity in India. Talking about sale, and I'll be focusing more on a stock sale transaction because that is the most common option that we see for liquidity. Unlike an IPO, this is largely a commercial and a contractual agreement between the parties involved. And of course, there are certain restrictions under law, which I'll be discussing in a minute. But largely, it is a deal which is negotiated between two private parties, completely contractually in terms of what are the rights and obligations, how the sale is going to be carried out, and especially from a valuation perspective, which is what is one of the key differentiators between an IPO and an M&A. Because for an M&A, there is no reference as such, and it is a valuation that is determined between the parties. And of course, from a foreign exchange law in India perspective, that valuation is something that has to be supported by a valuation report if the sale of shares is happening between a resident to non-resident or vice versa. Coming to some of the challenges that we see in M&A, one of the key ones is the pricing guidelines, which means that basically if a non-resident shareholder of an Indian company is selling his shares to an Indian resident, the price cannot be higher than the fair market value. Sorry, the price has to be cannot be higher than the fair market value. Similarly, even when the other side is happening, the pricing guidelines apply. So that is one of the key challenges that we see because it sort of severely restricts the pricing and a control premium or etc. Something that sellers like to achieve in these kind of third party transactions. Similarly, the other aspect where we see a lot of discussion and negotiation happening is the warranty and indemnity portion. Again, unlike an IPO, because it's a purely private transaction, this is something that we see being heavily negotiated in especially private equity exit deals, because one is the fund requirement or the capacity of the fund to undertake indemnity obligations. Also, like we discussed, because the funds have a limited life, and sometimes we see negotiations saying, parties want a sort of perpetual indemnity obligation, etc. Those don't really work when the seller is a private equity investor. So these are some of the concepts where we see heavy negotiation happening in private deals. Similarly, in terms of competition law, of course, this becomes very relevant in sort of big ticket transactions, and again, where there is a competition law issue involved, both in case of just a share sale or a merger transaction. This is something that we see, and in terms of accounting for the time period for it, this is something that should be kept in mind, especially where the CCI approval may be required. And one of the last points here is that one of the major advantages that you can think about in an M&A deal is the flexibility that the parties have to structure earnouts and payouts to the founders over a period of time. So it sort of gives you the leeway to agree on an upfront consideration and making a certain portion of the consideration subject to fulfillment of certain conditions over the next 6 months or 12 months, or subject to the performance of the company over a period of 12 months. So that is something you can structure very well in an M&A transaction. Also, of late, from the perspective of indemnity, we see a lot of increase for the, increase in demand for reps and warranties insurance, because it's something that's just beneficial for the promoters or the buyers, and also it helps the private equity investor who's selling the shares, because unnecessarily a fund life may not need to be extended, etc. So these are broadly some of the challenges legally and commercially that we see in IPO and M&A transactions. John, can we get your perspective on this from a US and a cross-border deal perspective?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, maybe first, I would just want to circle back quickly on the, because I think this in part maybe ties into some of the challenges that can be confronted. Circle back on the exit rights provisions that we were talking about, and obviously I certainly agree with Harshita and Samya that they're common in India companies and India venture deals. I would say that these exit right provisions that have a mandated exit period are not common at all in United States venture deals. I would say I also don't see them as much in Southeast Asia deals. And to the extent that we work with India companies that have externalized, even if the main operations remain in India and they've externalized to Singapore or Delaware, I'd say it's a bit of a mix, kind of a 50-50 mix in terms of whether those exit rights are there. And the principal reason that, in my view, frankly, and maybe this is an unpopular view to the extent that we have investors on the line, but I've told this to my investor clients as well. In my view, I find these exit rights to be practically ineffective, because at the end of the day, if you don't have the support of the founding team to exit a company, whether that's via an IPO or an acquisition, regardless of what the contract says, it's going to be really difficult to engineer a sale. Certainly difficult, if not impossible, to engineer a public offering, because any public offering is going to require the wholesale commitment of time and effort by management. But the same is true in an acquisition, because the diligence process associated with an acquisition is very intensive at a whole nother level of order relative to a standard venture financing. And so practically speaking, I think I find it questionable, the ability to enforce those exit rights. To the extent they are there just because it's something the investors need to have, I would say we typically would push for that exit period to be in the 5 to 7 year range, because to me, anything less than 5, especially for an early stage company, is just not a realistic exit horizon. I think most companies that we see exit are probably going to exit in that 5 to 7 and sometimes 8 or 9 year time horizon. I think number two, and this is a really important one, because Harshita did flag, I think very correctly, the fact that the one thing you do get introduced early on that you want to be really careful about is this price hurdle. And frankly, I think this is just as much a concern for the company as it is for the early stage investor, to introduce that price hurdle that would say, we're not going to, we have the ability to block any exit that does not see a return on our investment of at least, let's say 2x, 3x. Sometimes I've seen pushes for as high as 5x. And where that can really come back to bite you, and the early investors just as much as the founders, is that term, once it's introduced, is going to follow you at every stage along the way. And obviously with most venture-backed companies, the pace of financings, in some cases, it's usually on the order of every 12 to 18 months, usually not more than 24 months. So you could expect in that typical exit time horizon of 5 to 7 years, there's probably going to be 3 or 4 more rounds of financing. And if everything's going well, you're going to see an uptick in the valuation. So that price hurdle upon which a sale can be blocked by an investor or some investor group is only going to multiply as you go, because that term, once it's there, it's going to be very hard to get it back out. So when that Series C or Series D investor comes along, the valuation has quadrupled or gone up 5x, and therefore the price has gone up by that amount. Now your price, your hurdle to achieve an exit is 3, 4, 5x the already multiplied 5x value of your company. And you can imagine engineering sales of that magnitude and at that size can become very difficult. The last thing I'd point out is in these provisions, and this is generally two things I would say is also, I do think investors have typically sufficient protections around these exit rights just built into the reserve matters and the basic negative controls that they have, whether that's over an M&A, usually over any type of acquisition or sale of substantially all of the assets of a company, as well as an IPO. But one thing that I think companies should be aware of, and again, as well as investors, early stage and as you approach growth stage investors should be aware of, and you want to be very careful of, and we always, when we're advising, would be very cognizant of, is ideally avoiding situations where you have a single point of failure. And what I mean by that is giving any one investor full blocking rights over an exit, whether it's an acquisition or an IPO, or any of the reserve matters, frankly, because I think that can set up and create a significant challenge down the road. And ideally, what we try to engineer our transactions toward is a more democratic construct, where maybe it depends on, and there's a lot of ways and a lot of permutations in the way you can set up documents, but we try to set it up so that it's a more democratic construct, as opposed to, again, having that single point of failure where one investor can hold up an entire deal that the rest of the investor base and the founders and the rest of the shareholders may think is in the company's best interests. So that's, I just wanted to touch on those points and kind of set up some of the challenges that I have seen come to pass as companies grow and achieving exits. I think a couple of other, and maybe I'll just give some practice pointers that I've seen come to pass for companies as they scale. One is unique to Singapore, and I think with a lot of India companies that have flipped their structures to Singapore topcos, certainly prior to the 2017 changes in treaty benefits between Mauritius and India, and then by extension, Singapore and India. But even still, I see a number of India companies just due to geographic proximity flipping to Singapore. One thing to be aware of is the size of your cap table. So in Singapore, and it's, I think, very similar to India, there's a share registry. It's maintained by ACRA, the Accounting, Corporate and Regulatory Authority in Singapore. And the way that they track shareholders is it's by entity. And so just as an example, if a mutual fund, let's say a T. Rowe Price, or Wellington or some sort of, or Morgan Stanley mutual fund owns stock in your company, usually those mutual funds will actually hold shares through a variety of entities. And in some cases, it can be a very large number. And each of those would be deemed a stockholder on your ACRA share registry. They would be listed individually as stockholders with their own stock certificates. And the issue here is that in Singapore, when you cross 50 shareholders on the ACRA share registry, you become or trip into becoming an unlisted public company. So even if everything about your company remains private in the way that you operate, and you're definitely not publicly listing your shares, when you trip that 50 shareholder limit, you are compelled to become a public unlisted company. And on the one hand, and this is not as onerous, and I've had to do this for one client before, there is a one-time disclosure requirement. It's a very light prospectus sets of disclosures that are required to be made. It's a one-time filing, not a repeat filing. And while there's some hand-wringing over the disclosure there, that's not the biggest issue. But the bigger issue is in Singapore, you then become subject to the takeover code here, which is it spawns, and it's very much based off of the United Kingdom, the UK's takeover code. And without going into the nitty-gritty, I will just say, having experienced this in a very large M&A exit for one of our company clients that we represented for many years. That takeover code makes engineering your typical acquisitions, and in particular what Sami was mentioning, the representations and warranties, and in particular the indemnities that most buyers would expect. The takeover code really limits your ability to provide those reps, warranties, indemnities, and structure acquisitions in the way that virtually every buyer of a venture-backed business would expect. And it effectively can kill a deal. So in this particular example, it was so onerous, and we had such a difficult time organizing around it, that back to the other forms of liquidity transactions we talked about, we actually had to engineer a secondary liquidity transaction where the company bought back shares from a large number of shareholders in order to get us back below the 50 shareholder limit and out from under the takeover code before we then proceeded to sign the acquisition agreement and finalize the acquisition. So that's one just regulatory hurdle to bear in mind. I think the other thing I would say, and then I'll pause and let Harshita jump back in. I think as companies think about whether it's an IPO or whether it's an acquisition, and regardless of whether you're an India company, Singapore incorporated company, or a Delaware or US incorporated company, I think there is naturally progressions that companies need to make from that earlier kind of startup phase to that later stage growth equity and thinking toward an exit. And certainly it's more pronounced on in the IPO context, especially in the United States, in terms of requirements around the sufficiency of audited financial statements and your internal control measures, your general corporate governance, and certainly in the context of an IPO, there are a lot of requirements that the various stock exchanges have for how you must govern yourself, the manner in which your board is constructed, the independence of your board, the committees that you have on your board, again, your internal controls from a financing and corporate accounting perspective, the sophistication of the audits that you need typically from a Big Four accounting company. So there's a lot of growth that has to occur within the company as you mature. And I would say that while that's virtually required for most companies to go public, and why in most cases of companies going public, I would say you need to allot yourself a minimum of 12 months to start preparing properly to go public and make sure you've got the right internal controls in place. I would say that those same controls and those same issues, though, will benefit you in the context of an M&A exit, because when you have a large public buyer, whether it's a Facebook or an Apple, Amazon, Cisco, Intel, I think the process is certainly going to be much smoother, just given the nature of those entities and their own internal controls that they have as public companies. I think it's going to be a much smoother process for your acquisition if you have a lot of those internal procedures and controls and governance measures in place.
Thank you, John. I think John and Soumya would have explained quite a bit on the legal and regulatory requirements, both from an India and a cross-border perspective. And moving on, I think besides a lot of legal and regulatory requirements that are there in each of the scenarios or each of the approaches that you decide to go, there are a lot of commercial considerations which run behind as well. So you need to decide basis and try and marry the commercial considerations with the legal and the regulatory considerations that come alongside, and see which approach is essentially the best approach, which you should take, whether to go IPO or you want to go ahead and try go down the route of acquisitions and find a buyer for yourself. I think just one last bit from you, John. If in terms of managing, and we understand that there are regulatory challenges, managing cross-border deals, but in terms of your deal experience, how has it been, working with different jurisdictions and managing it, on cross-border transactions?
Yeah, sure. It's an open-ended question. Let me see if I can. The good news, or what I've found broadly speaking, is that a lot of the same issues arise regardless of the jurisdiction in which you're operating, whether that's having to think about competition analysis or other regulatory requirements. obviously the reviewing commercial contracts, or depending on the nature of the businesses, the licenses of the businesses, depending on where they operate, and the transferability of those licenses, the change of control terms in your commercial contracts, the negotiations around indemnities in an acquisition. I mean, that's always, whether you're a Singapore entity, an India entity, or a Delaware entity, that's always where a lot of the action is going to be, in structuring, whether it's escrows and holdbacks, and the manner and the nature of indemnification. So I think in a lot of ways there are certainly a lot of similarities. I think some of the bigger challenges, probably one of the biggest that we haven't really touched on, and I'd say, I mean, I know, the NDA team is certainly well versed in, and we've worked with them a ton on advising in these areas alongside usually a Big Four accounting firm, is tax. And I think tax, that's going to be front and center in every deal. And I think, again, while there's comfort in the fact that regardless of the jurisdiction you're in, the tax is going to be a big consideration, I do think the nature of those tax considerations and tax concerns around whether it's an IPO or an acquisition are going to vary depending on where the principal operations of the business are, where the employees sit, where the investors are resident relative to the business, and the both direct as well as indirect tax rules of the particular jurisdiction. And there's no question, as NDA I'm sure can attest, India does have one of the more challenging tax jurisdictions to navigate around, although candidly, I think after the roll-off of kind of the double taxation benefits that we had between India and Mauritius and India and Singapore in 2017, although I think there was some hand-wringing and some concern around what that meant, I do think it has at least provided more certainty for investors as well as for companies in terms of modeling. Okay, now I know long-term capital gain, I'm gonna have to pay an indirect tax unless I'm a small, I can avail myself of a small shareholder exemption or some other exemption. I'm likely going to have to pay some tax in India, and you kind of just build that into your IRR modeling. But tax, again, I think is one of the other areas that, depending on the jurisdictions at play, can again, consistent, but also would vary pretty considerably depending on the jurisdictions in question.
Absolutely, John. I think you rightly pointed out. So tax in itself, becomes complex when, and specifically when, when I talk about the India tax systems, as well as when we talk about cross-border tax issues. And the reason why we did not deep dive into tax specifically in this session is that we can take up a separate session exclusively on tax, and we can go on for it, on it and the different tax issues that emerge out of these transactions, and the different nuances specifically from a cross-border perspective for an hour, and it can be in a session in itself. So I think on this note, and I think we do not probably have a lot of Q&A, so I would request Nishith if he has any closing comments or anything he may want to add from his insights into and his experience of being engaged in cross-border for several years now.
I think your discussion was extremely helpful, very clear, very good. And I don't want to add too much, but what I would say is that, these are the times for even startups to think, and there's so much to do in that space. And a lot more startup will come. A lot of people will lose their jobs, but I think this is the time when one has to really think about starting something new, exciting, to change the world for the better. And obviously, when you start something, to an extent, you will also have to consider what are the issues in exits, and a lot of debate whether to go IPO, to get acquired, but you have to be prepared for both and which your suits at that point of time. So I think what you all said is very relevant, very useful, very clear, and I'm sure a lot of our audience will be benefited out of the whole. And I just wanted to thank John and Soumya and Harshita. Of course, he did a brilliant job. So let's leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
So I think just for the audience, in terms of the Q&As, you can direct your questions to the panelists, and if you were not able to answer your queries, you can write to us and we will get back to you offline. John can, maybe John can leave his email in the Q&A bit. So if anybody wants to contact, John, in relation to cross-border issues or, Singapore or US specifically, John can be the person to go to. So John, if you could just put in your email ID in the Q&A, so for the audience to get in touch. And, our email IDs are as well available. We will, thank you so much for joining us today. And we will get back to you with another interesting session next Thursday. John,
Yeah,
you were saying something?
Yeah, real quick. So it looked like there was one question, and then I may actually need some help on how to add my email to the Q&A. But I see one question from Anant. It looks like on the Q&A regarding Singapore as a destination of choice, and to address corporate structure, one or more share classes. So maybe, if you don't mind, I'll just take a couple minutes, because I do think this is increasingly becoming something that, again, I alluded to the treaty benefits, particularly with India and Singapore kind of pulling off. And so I have seen in the last 3 years an increasing, although I still see a number of India startups that choose to externalize to Singapore, I would say increasingly I am seeing startups that choose to go to Delaware and set up in the United States. And so, while I don't have market data to say like what the percentage is, it certainly feels like it's approaching closer to 50-50, whereas prior to 2017 I would have said almost 80, 85, 90, if not 90+% of the time it was Singapore. The one thing I would say for any company that's thinking about externalizing, first and foremost, and I'll go back to tax. Tax is the paramount consideration for externalizing your company. And first of all, whether it makes sense at all. And second of all, if it does, which jurisdiction. And the one thing, while I think there are certainly, and I'm of course I'm biased, I'm a US lawyer, I think there are a lot of benefits to the US and to a Delaware topco. The one thing you should be very aware of from a tax perspective is once you avail yourself of the United States corporate tax net, it is very hard to get back out. And so you really do want to make sure as part of your analysis and your business analysis, you're thinking through what makes the most sense, not just from a tax perspective for your business and thinking about where is your IP going to ultimately reside within the corporate structure, what types of transfer pricing analysis do you need to conduct depending on how you view your business growing, where do you view your employee base sitting. There's a lot of tax considerations to think about, but there's also just plain business considerations. And I see a lot of companies that say, oh, I want to go to Delaware because I think the investor pool is deeper, but I have no ambitions of having any business in the United States or hiring any employees in the United States. My business is going to be 100% India, at most some Southeast Asia exposure. And there I would say I would caution in terms of thinking about where to incorporate. But at the end of the day, I would always recommend getting tax advice from an international tax accountant. Obviously, I typically would recommend a Big Four, whether that's PwC, EY, KPMG, but there's also very good large international tax firms like Grant Thornton, and we also have a number that work with a bunch of our venture-backed companies that we can recommend. But international tax advice is important. To the other question that Anant asked, I would say, when you think about how you structure your company, and to me, honestly, this is true regardless of whether you're in Singapore, Delaware, or you remain in India, my baseline counsel to all of my founder-backed companies is keep it simple. I think where companies get out in front of themselves a little too much, especially in the early stages, is they make things more complicated than they need to be, whether that's with dual class stock, because frankly, I think a lot of that is the markets are moving away from that, and the receptivity of the public market certainly to that is not as high. I guess obviously if you're Zuckerberg of Facebook or you're Google, then maybe you're in a different case, but those are rare companies. And so I think keeping your cap structure simple, keeping your governance simple, and as I alluded to earlier, ideally democratic, is useful, and just keeping your business as simple and as clean as possible, I think is ultimately going to, regardless of the jurisdiction where you operate, is going to set you up for success, and it's going to make not only exit conversations simpler, but also future rounds of financing simpler, because the more you have to, investors, especially in today's market, they're only looking for a reason to say no. And the more complicated you make your business, the easier it is for them to find a reason to say no.
Just to interrupt here for a moment, I think wonderful comments, John. We are actually planning to have another taxation on June 3rd, if I'm not mistaken, and then perhaps one more.
Right.
And we'll let the audience know about it, So,
So in
more
fact,
specific flips and stuff like that. We'll look into that. Yeah.
in fact, just to add on to John, and we had an interesting panel last night at 9 p.m. IST on exclusively dealing with structures and externalizations, though it was largely focused on the US. But John, you rightly pointed out that there has to be a strong business case and commercial reasons to be deciding to flip, whether whichever jurisdiction it is. And specifically, to Anand's question, where you are a bootstrap fintech startup incorporated in India, bear in mind that there are a lot of structural and legal and regulatory concerns in India, in terms of round tripping, ODI regulations, the foreign exchange regulations, etc. So the structure that you take in India, or the structure which you decide to adopt for your flipping, becomes very important. And because you may be bootstrapped now, and I think it will be a good time to probably go flip your structure before you have more investors on the cap table, because the later the more you sit on it, and the delay, the more difficult and complex it becomes. And again, then there are complex tax issues from an India perspective, in terms of POEM, the place of effective management, and the general anti-avoidance rules that are there in India. So all these needs to be carefully taken into account before you go and decide to externalize your structure, and whether it is Singapore or to the US. So just bear that in mind. And I think, as Nishith pointed out, we are taking a specific session on June 3rd, exclusively dealing with tax issues in externalizations. And I think you'll get the invite for the same soon.
Yeah, I just add one small thing here that, today what has happened, it's just not about going on the whiteboard and drawing a structure. It's more about translating the structure into documentation because of the general anti-avoidance provisions and the other poem-like criteria coming in. It has become very important to articulate your documentation in a way that it brings out a true story, or that is just not for tax purposes, but there are other reasons as well. So recital clause becomes very important, because after 5 years, when tax department will raise an issue, if you just find some reason at that point of time, it may be difficult for you to prove that there were some other reasons other than the tax. Because if tax is the only reason, then probably tax department may ignore that transaction and hit you badly. So it is important that very carefully articulated recital clauses and some other clauses that go into the tax structuring are properly documented. I think that is the other message that I would like to give. Thank you.